Hello, everyone. It's Kristi, and as you guys know from the announcement I made earlier this week, I am having Philip Moriarty on the show. He's a professor with astronomy and physics, and we're going to be
just physics, not astronomy.
Okay, the department is that, I think, but you're right. You're doing physics, not just physics. And
yeah.
By way of background. We got in touch sort of on social, communicating online because we are both committed to using the scientific process consistently and appropriately, no matter what the object of inquiry is. And given that we're sort of like in a mutual appreciation society, at least on dealing with some of the bad things on YouTube and having the goals of having the discourse on science sort of elevated a bit on YouTube, that, we wanted to have a chat. And so he kindly agreed to come on the show. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for the invitation, Kristi. Huge pleasure to meet you at last.
Yes, we've been corresponding just all through, like electronic correspondence so far. So it's lovely to finally, have a chat in person where we don't have to worry about, like character limits or time. So the thing that now you're going to be doing, I hope, a lot of the talking, because one of the things I like about my An Atheist Asks show is that I can listen to really interesting people and ask them what I hope are interesting questions. But we have some common themes that we've talked about, and you are going to be having a talk that you're giving on peer review. And so, do you want to give some, I don't want you to scoop yourself, of course, in your talk, but if you want to maybe kick off the conversation with introducing the concept of peer review to people, maybe your experiences with it, and then some of the concerns, and also the things that you like about it, or wherever you wanted to kind of take the conversation.
So I'm actually doing a talk next week at something called PubCon, which is something organized by the Institute of Physics. As a physicist, I interact quite heavily with the Institute of Physics in the UK, as you might expect. I guess what I should do is just give a little bit of background to who I am and what I do. So I'm a professor of physics. I'm a professor of physics, University of Nottingham. I've been at Nottingham a long time. Did my PhD at Dublin City University. Had a really great time there. Came to Nottingham in '94. Worked as a postdoc from '94 to '97. Got a lectureship in '97, and then I've sort of worked my way up the chain over the last few years. Got a professorship in 2005. So that's a sort of brief career history. The research that we do, the research that the group does, within the group at the moment we have 4 postdocs, and so that's people who have done their PhD and gone on to further research, and 6 PhD students. And throughout, well, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, our focus has been on manipulating single atoms, manipulating single molecules. We're now at the point with these type of techniques, we use something called scanning probe microscopes, which is pretty easy to explain, pretty difficult to set up experimentally. But you take a sharp probe, you bring it in close to a surface, and when I say close, within a few atomic diameters, you move it back and forth, you measure some type of force or some type of interaction, and from how that force varies at each point, you build up an image. And if the probe is somewhat sharper than this and is atomically sharp, then you pretty well get atomic resolution. Indeed, the state of the art now is the single bond, the single electron orbital at the end of that probe, to give you single bond resolution. And we want to manipulate atoms at that level, to single atom manipulation. The usual way I explain what we do when I'm giving public talks is that ultimately we'd like to do 3D printing with atoms. Could you set a computer up to build a structure atom by atom? So that was a long-winded introduction to what we do, but I think it's important, given that you're a social scientist, given that an awful lot of the things that we're going to talk about, and I think an awful lot of, issues, associated with, the type of exchanges that go on YouTube, is what people are saying, are claiming that we're following the scientific method, you're not following the scientific method, therefore you're wrong. And I think it's probably worthwhile, therefore, that I sort of lay my cards on the table and describe the type of stuff we do.
Can I just say, what you do sounds so cool.
Yeah. So it's very interesting because you go, well, I'd love to say I get in the lab. I don't get in the lab as much as I like at all now. I work with a fantastic group of people, fantastic group of dedicated, fun people. And the problem is when you're doing it every day, it gets mundane, or it can get mundane, and you have to continually check yourself and come back and go, yeah, actually, we're moving atoms. We're moving stuff around at those basic building block levels. Yeah, exactly. And you've just got to go, wow. And so, that's something that I've been interested in for a long, long time. I remember getting a microscope when I was 9 or 10 as a Christmas present. So I've always been interested in the really small. Of course, weird things happen down there in terms of quantum mechanics. We might even get onto a bit of quantum mechanics later on. But so it's interesting. I think sometimes quantum mechanics is exploited and abused, and I think there are some. I have an awful lot of time, as you know, Kristi, for social scientists. There are some in the social science community who play fast and loose with certain ideas from physics and try to import them to explain sort of sociological things, and they just overreach. By many, many light years, and that's dangerous for a number of reasons. So maybe we can get back to that, but that's getting well off the theme. So you mentioned, I've got this talk next week. It's a talk that it'll be a variation on a theme that I've given before. If you'll excuse the alliteration, the overkill and the alliteration, it's something like, if I get the P's in the right order, the power and perils of peer review in public, something along those lines. And it's there's somebody called Alan Partridge. I don't know if you're familiar with that comedy. So I was reading his autobiography, his mock or spoof autobiography,
Bouncing
and
Back.
Was sort of yeah, indeed.
I have it.
Yeah, it's called but there's an I Partridge as well, and in that he says, I love alliteration. There's nothing that can't be made better by having a good dose of alliteration. And I was going sort of, note to self, must stop using so much alliteration, because Partridge does it. It's obviously something to avoid.
Yeah, the only thing better is monkey tennis.
Indeed, yeah, just classic. I love Partridge. I love the whole thing he came from, the day-to-day and on the air, and Chris Morris. But again, let's try to keep on topic. Just a little bit. I have a habit of doing that. So the talk I'm giving is really in terms of peer review, and it's actually part of a panel discussion as well this time around, which I'm really looking forward to. So what are the issues with peer review? The issues with peer review and the issues with the scientific process, and particularly let's link it back to what happens generally on YouTube, is that people pull a paper out of the literature. They've done they've gone to Google, they've done a keyword search, and they've found a paper that seems to back up what they say. That is remarkably credulous and remarkably naive to do that. Peer review is not perfect. Published in the literature is not perfect. We spent best part of 2 years, and this really brought it home to me. It's why I'm a little bit more, I've always been quite vocal about it, but I've got a lot more vocal about it over the last few years. We spent 2 years pursuing basically a reanalysis of data from published by a group, initially at MIT, now at ETH in Zurich. So those are pretty good institutions, as you probably know. And about 25 to 30 papers based on an artifact, right? On a very rudimentary artifact. The type of thing that if an undergraduate presented it in a second year or third year undergraduate report, they would get a low mark because it showed, I'm not going to go, yeah.
Yeah, what is an artifact? And can you just explain that for?
So an artifact is, in this context or in any real context, is you want to make a measurement. You want to make sure that the measurement you're making is a true representation of the sample. But always, any measurement you make at some level involves a coupling of the sample properties and the properties of the imaging system. Let's say we're talking about microscopes in this case, so the properties of the microscope system. What you want to do is try to get at the raw properties of the sample, but you have to take account of how you're imaging it, how you're doing the measurement. And too often we get very excited particularly sort of when you see something new and nobody else has seen this before, and you get very excited and you think this is just phenomenal and we have to publish this. You have to be careful not to just to, you know, double check yourself, but triple check, quadruple, quintuple check yourself, and make sure that you ask those questions. Is this real? Is this absolutely real? And do control measurements, strip back everything that could be giving you this signal, and think about it really, really carefully. And physicists generally spend an awful lot of their time, some cases, perhaps arguably the majority of their time, chasing up these what could be very mundane, seem to be very mundane, very routine checks. But without those checks, you can get fooled so easily. And moreover, pressure is so intense to publish, particularly for early career researchers. And this is another issue where I spend a lot of time thinking about, and actually I'm currently chairing a committee at the University of Nottingham focused on early career researchers and PhD students, particularly for those early career researchers that are up and up and up in terms of what they need to get a position, to get a permanent position. So that's a recipe to cut corners. That's a recipe, not, you know, if you have papers in a certain period and they have to be in those top class journals, or those supposedly top tier journals, what you mightn't do all the time is double check, triple check, quadruple check yourself. You might just go, it's good enough, let's get it out there. So there's a real recipe for disaster there, because there is so much pressure in the system. And so the talk next week is about not just those aspects, but also the peer review system itself. And the key thing is it's rather archaic. And I think you'll probably agree that in this day and age, particularly somebody who's as socially media wired as yourself, it's really bizarre that the way a paper is published is that you send it off to a journal. The journal editors send it out to 1, 2, 3. I don't know what it's like in the social sciences. I don't think it's going to be that much different. 1, 2, 3 different referees.
Ideally, yeah.
Okay. So it would be rare in physics, certainly we'll have more than 3 reviewers. Typically, physics and chemistry, we're talking about 3 reviewers. And you send it off to them. Our process of sending it out, getting the comments back, you responding to the comments, sending a resubmission, perhaps having another round of comments, etc., that can take anything up to a year. And moreover, your paper is published on the basis of 3 sets of referees' comments. And I know from experience in physics, and again, I don't think it's going to be hugely different in social science, that often you will get comments back that clearly show that the referee has either not read the paper particularly carefully. I know this can sound like sour grapes, or moreover and worse, is completely clueless with regard to the area. The corollary of that, and this is important, because you also get very important referees' comments. And I would say that the majority of our papers have been improved by addressing those comments. But you also get, you know, that's 1 or 2 sets of comments, and your paper is published that way. And then, and this is the crucial thing, and this is the thing we as academics and scientists in general have to get beyond, that's seen as the end of the process. The paper is published, particularly if it goes into one of those journals, Science, Nature, etc. Then what happens is that when that paper is published and that researcher or those researchers, let's say the lead author on that paper is a postdoc and they go to look for a job, here's the key issue. What will happen is that the people reviewing that will look at the list of papers, they go, oh, published in Nature, published in Science, oh, obviously quite good, without even reading the paper. We outsource the quality assessment to the brand name of the journal. And that's shocking. And I've sat on many committees, where peering committees, where, you know, one person, the person opposite on the other side of the table will be talking to his or her neighbor, and they'll say, oh, look, candidate X has got better papers than candidate Y, without ever having read them, simply on the basis of the name of the journal. And that really winds me up so much.
I can't say that I have had much experience that's any different from what you've said in terms of like the number of reviewers, the experience of going through review. Also, the lousy reviewers. I had 3 sentences in a review in one journal. Then we changed it up, sent it to another place. They got the same reviewer. He just copy and pasted the exact same 3-line review and sent it back. But then in our 3rd journal, we had an amazing reviewer, and the paper got so much better. And I've actually have a video on like the process of peer review and how how to handle peer review.
I saw this,
Yeah,
absolutely. And the problem is, the thing, of course, is that the first opportunity, the first thing you go is bloody referee doesn't know what they're talking about. And you hammer away at the keyboard. The best thing is not to do that, or type it out and then sleep on it. Just get it out of your system and then sleep on it. And invariably, you come back and read that and go, "Oh no, that's just a bit over the top," and come back. But the issue, I think, is, there's so many different issues.
Yeah, and the fetishization of high-profile journals too. It's also the same problems, So just to echo
absolutely. that. Yeah, and in terms of, I'm sure you've got this nonsensical impact factor nonsense
of course.
as well. Which is just, the idea that the quality of a paper is directly related to the impact factor of the journal. We're physicists. We're meant to be relatively numerate. We're meant to understand statistics at some level. It's just remarkable that we do that. There's a fantastic blog post by a guy called Stephen Curry. He's a physicist, biophysicist, actually, at Imperial College. I follow his blog. He's a really good writer. He wrote this classic called "I'm Sick of Impact Factors," about journal impact factors, quantify the impact or the reach of a journal, which I think thousands, probably tens of thousands of people have now read. And there are many things wrong, right? So there are many things wrong with the peer review system, which is why when these debates go on YouTube, and you have these, papers being dragged out because somebody's spent 2.5 minutes doing a Google search on the basis of one keyword, and then this paper's pulled out as a real gotcha. Look, this is my claims. That's not how we do science. It's, as I've said, I've had some exchanges under your video, and as I've said to a number of people there, go and read a paper, read a scientific paper. And that's another thing. I don't think a lot of reading often goes on behind these debates on YouTube. But go and read a scientific paper. Look at the introduction. There might be 30, 40, sometimes 50, particularly in chemistry, maybe 50 papers cited there, where they try to go, look, is there a controversy here? Is everything settled? Are we just sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's? Or are we really making a big difference here? What's happened previously in the field? They don't just go, here's one paper, they agree with us, end of story. It's just, there is a great and deep misunderstanding of how science works, and how peer review works, and also the idea that peer review is an absolute gold standard. Peer review gets it wrong, and peer review gets it wrong badly. And moreover, we've had in terms of variability in peer review, you mentioned it in terms of that 3 lines and then going to the same referee and getting the same 3 lines back. We've had sort of the converse, where we've had a grant application, submitted it once. This was back in the days when we could resubmit grant applications. Submitted it once, came about 3/4 of the way down the panel, sent back, were allowed to resubmit, or did resubmit, made minimal changes at best, came halfway up the panel, just below in the upper half of the panel, just below the funding threshold. Sent it back. We made no changes at all. None. Resubmitted it, top. So, and I did that time I came top. So it goes to show you, and this is why, if we can finally couple it into sociology, the idea that you've got this incredibly purely objective process in science, and everything is done in a purely objective way, and there are no biases there, and everything's without any type of sociological bias, and it's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. I mentioned, sorry, yeah.
The recruitment, like who gets invited to do peer review and who accepts peer review, is something that we don't really talk about.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So you get regular emails from journals asking you to do review, particularly if you submit something to a journal.
Then they have your name.
Absolutely, they've got your name on board, so they will ask you. And to be fair, you know, somebody else in the community has reviewed your paper, and I think most of us do it because we feel it's you know, it's a duty. That makes it sound too onerous. It's not that. It's like
it's part of
we're
being
sort
the
of
member
giving
of the
back
community.
something to the community.
I think
Exactly.
Can
That's
I just
exactly it.
Because I did a peer review.
Yeah.
So I was invited by, I mean, I'll say the journal, but obviously I won't talk about the details of the article. It was Electoral Studies. And they said, would you do this peer review because you do qual? And by the time I got done with it, it took me like in total probably about 8 hours because I read it the first time through and thought about what I wanted to say. And then I went back to it and read it again. And by the time I was done with it, I had 4 pages of notes because I really liked their findings, but I just like had problems with everything else. I'm like, okay, but here are my problems, but this is what I want you to do. And I think when you do this, it'll make it so much better. And I try to be the kind of reviewer that makes my papers better.
Exactly. And the problem is, Kristi, in all of our fields, why isn't that stuff going online? This is what I meant about the archaic nature of it. What should happen is that our reports should go online with the paper. And there was absolutely no reason not to do that. And in fact, a number of journals are slowly starting to do that.
I'll join that campaign.
But you do it right. Yes, brilliant. The more people can get on board, the better. But you did it the right way. And that you said 8 hours. That's typical. If you really want to do a good job, but often it's absolutely clear that 8 hours has not been put into the reviewing of a paper. And, you know, that's sort of understandable because it depends on when that paper arrives. Let's say you've got a grant application to do. Let's say, like I've been for the last blooming, seems like an eternity, marking first year reports, lab reports, that have just taken up 4 days of my time. And that's 4 days gone that I can't work on anything else while I'm doing that. Let's say it comes in the exam marking period. Let's say it comes when you're about to go to a conference or something. All those type of issues will change the level of input and the level of diligence you will apply to in that paper, which again is this idea that everything is always entirely objective, even when it comes to the, if we must call it that, the hard sciences and physical sciences. You know, the idea that other environmental and sociological issues don't couple into how that science is reviewed is anybody who's involved in science, anybody who's published will know that, you know, no, there are biases there, and there are certain referees who are, you know, clearly in some cases have some type of agenda going on. There are certain referees who will perhaps be working in a very similar area and will block papers, all those type of things.
Yeah, but I like your idea of putting the reports online for a couple of reasons. One, because you would see the full range of feedback that people are capable of producing. And also, I think it would make people take their reports a bit more seriously and probably reduce the asshole factor a little bit. If, you know, I mean, they
Precisely.
might... Yeah, it's even if they know that no one's going to know, they might still feel an obligation to be nicer if they know those words are going to be up there on the internet and they're going to be their words.
So that brings us on neatly to the whole question of anonymity. I'm not a fan at all of online anonymity. This is a matter of principle, not practice. I know there is no way of doing this unless we somehow change the culture. But, you know, if we talk about those YouTube comments, so much of the nastiness, not always, but a great deal of the nastiness, you know, comes from SJ Slayer 1992 or SJW Slayer 1992 or whatever, frothing at the mouth and a tirade of abuse. You know, and what really winds me up is that often these people will say, you know, it's just pixels on the screen, they're just words. Why are you so offended? And when I tackle them on this, as I've done in the past, and say, you know, well, it's cravenly, absolutely cravenly cowardly behavior to hide behind a pseudonym and sling out this abuse. That's not the behavior of a bully. That's the behavior of the sort of bully's weaselly friend that cowers in the shadows. It really winds me up. How does that couple into academia? Well, I think you're absolutely right in terms of people spending a lot more time considering the words if they know that those words are going to be attached to their reputation. And the best way to attach it to a reputation is let's put our names to our reviews. I've had a long debate with a site called PubPeer on this. Their argument is that if you demand that people sign reviews, online reviews at their site, they see the numbers drop off dramatically. And I can understand why that is. And I'm not arguing at all, of course, that we do something as draconian as demand this. I'm just saying, wouldn't it be good to nudge the culture, or try to nudge the culture towards, let's be open, let's put our names to what we write, instead of either on YouTube, either in the online fora or in scientific reviewing, just hiding behind anonymity. It's a fairly contentious point.
No, actually, I don't think that's an easy step in that direction is to have journals where you have the option of attaching your name, because maybe the authors do want to contact you afterwards, or they want to, work on another paper with you because you've been so helpful. I mean, I think that at least having the option of saying, I would prefer to be anonymous, I would like my name associated with the report, at least we should have the option as the people putting in the work, because we're not getting paid for it. So we should have more options, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I've got a colleague, Raphael Levy, who worked on this paper I was mentioning before with us. And that's exactly what he does. He reviews. I've started to sign my reviews over the last while as well. And it's, I do think if we edge towards that, the argument is, and I can understand this argument, the counter argument is, of course, there is a little bit of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, that can come into this, in that if you get a good review from somebody and you know who they are, and let's say their paper ends up on your desk a couple of weeks later, you are sort of naturally predisposed to paper a little bit more kindly than if you get a paper from somebody who absolutely tore your last paper to shreds and rejected it. That's just human nature. You're just going to be, there is going to be a bias, and you can work as hard as you like and can try to be as objective as you like, but we're all human.
Yeah, there might be a level of recusal there. But then again, in terms of book reviews, I've been asked to review books by colleagues that I've, those were book reviews, so they weren't quite as important. But I do think that, yeah, there's, again, the possibility for anonymity, but also too, maybe a declaration of interest, just, have you had somebody that or have learned their name afterwards review any of your papers? If so, just put their names down and declare that to the editors. And then the way the editors won't send that out, or accounting on a recusal of, this person gave me a review and I know them, so I don't feel I can be unbiased or something. I don't think I think there are workarounds.
Yeah. So. Yeah, no, I agree entirely. It's just, I honestly think, and as I said, I had this have you come across PubPeer at all? Are you familiar with the site?
No, I mean, I learned about it from you mentioning it with the two studies, the one that was broken apart and in comparison. But if you want to tell the viewers about it.
Yeah, I try actually every seminar I give now, technical seminar or otherwise, every conference talk, I try to bring up PubPeer, and I ask for a show of hands, and it's going up a little bit, but it's never more than 5% of the audience have heard of PubPeer. So PubPeer is a post-publication peer review site, and I have so much time for many elements of it apart from anonymity, but I'll talk about the good elements first of all. It comes back to the idea that, you publish the paper, it's published in Nature or Science or whatever journal, and that's the end of the story. That's instead of that being the point where the discussion starts, the scientific discussion starts, that's very often the place where the scientific discussion ends, and that's an issue. So with PubPeer, any paper that has a DOI, digital object identifier, any paper that's available online that's been published, you can just upload that and you can start a discussion on that paper. And I think this is exactly the way we should go. I think also in terms of improving the quality of the debate. For example, if we could give credit to people who write very good reviews, or particularly early career researchers, that would be great. We've even cited in a couple of papers, Raphael has also cited in one of his papers, PubPeer comments, because those comments were so good. And it's interesting, one of the other things that came up under your video, one of the comments threads, the argument seems to be made, if you're making points on a blog post, that's somehow that's secondary to any type of published paper. I've seen better better science described in blog posts than I've seen in some peer-reviewed papers. And why shouldn't we, if the argument is coherent, if the argument is good, if the evidence is there, why shouldn't we use blog posts? Why shouldn't we use PubPeer comments? Why shouldn't we use comments under papers in the scientific process? And with PubPeer, a large number, the majority of the comments are pretty good in terms of flagging up difficulties with papers. There was a lot, you might remember this a couple of years back. It's a bit of a tragic case in many ways. There was a great deal of furore about a new process for generating stem cells, just using effectively shock treatment, almost like chemical shock treatment of normal cells. And this was like 2 back, got through peer review, and within a week, possibly much less than a week, maybe even within a few days, PubPeer community was on top of this, going, hang on, there's something wrong here. To cut a long story short, those papers ended up being retracted, but they got through peer review. It was only after they'd been published in those key journals. Similarly, and this really, I think, in my community brings it home, there was a paper published at the end of 2013 in Science, which many of us aim for, that claimed that they had seen hydrogen bonds, had seen images of hydrogen bonds, had actually visualized hydrogen bonds for the first time using the technique I mentioned, the scanning probe microscope. And hydrogen bonds, for those who don't know, are extremely important in biochemistry and chemistry in general, particularly in terms of interactions between strands of DNA. So seeing these things in real space, as we put it, seeing these things, being able to visualize them, is a really big deal. But again, it was an artifact. It was an issue with the probe. The probe was generating these things, not the sample. And this is something that the community's discussed. But here's forgetting about all the minutiae of the science, the key thing is this: that science paper is clearly flawed. It's still getting citations, and I'm not going to mention the group, because in many ways they did a reasonably good job. It's just that their interpretation was a little bit over-enthusiastic, let's put it that way. A paper published in what many would consider, and I'm going to put it in quotes, a lesser journal, even though it's a very good journal, called Physical Review, was published about a year later, showing up all the issues with this interpretation. Now, here's the key thing. The science paper is on that author's CV. The Physical Review B paper is on this guy's CV. If those two people go for a job, here's what will happen: is that the committee will look at the CVs and they go, oh, this person's published in Science. This person's only published in Physical Review B. This person's better than this person, despite the fact that it was the person in the lesser journal that had the much better and much more correct interpretation. And that's just one example from our many other examples, which is why, coming back to the central theme of all of this idea that you just go, you Google for 5 minutes and you pick out keywords and you go, oh, this paper agrees with my particular preference, therefore I win, is just ludicrous. Nobody does, and nobody who's credible in science. If you want to be a hack, yeah, do it that way. But anybody who's credible in science, you don't do it on the basis of a paper, of a single paper. You look for a consensus, you look for repetition, reproducibility, all these type of things.
Yeah, and I think staying on this theme, if you were to give advice about how things on YouTube could be improved in terms of that, what should people be doing? Because some of it is behind paywalls, which is another huge issue that I'm sure we could rant about at length. The profit or this monetization of scientific research findings, and then the public that paid for them with their tax dollars can't actually access them, and libraries have to pay to get access to their own research. But leaving that aside, as tempting as it is to go down that rabbit hole, yeah, what would you like to see done more in terms of when people say those kinds of things? How should they approach it instead? What would be your advice?
So here's my advice: read. That's my one-word piece of advice. Read. What I found remarkable, Kristi, is that you posted that, and thank you for doing this, posted that video on the blog post I wrote.
Of course.
And thank you so much for doing that. What's really interesting is you asked, did I see a spike in hits? I saw a small spike in hits, maybe 50 to 70 people, right? That video of yours has got probably 1,000 views, which means a small, tiny fraction are actually going to read the original blog post. I find that remarkable. Moreover, I even asked those in the comments threads who were making comments, did you read the original post? And some of them had the audacity to say, no, I didn't bother. I don't want to bother reading. That level of not just ignorance, but willful ignorance. I'm not going to go chase back and look at the source. Just, that's not the way you do science. You go back, and sometimes you might have a citation trail, which will take you all the way back to, I don't know, an Einstein paper from the 20s or whatever. And you follow that trail back and you do your homework. You read. You don't just, do, as I say, a 5-minute Google search and a couple of keywords, pull out a single paper that you think, backs up your case and go, da-da, gotcha. That's not credible. And I think a key issue here is a lack of reading and an unwillingness to actually trace the literature to and spend the time to read. I'm not saying I'm a paragon of virtue at all, but I must admit that I honestly don't think you can put across a credible scientific argument unless you're actually going to read those papers. In another debate I had, and I've spent far too much time online debating, I must admit. But in another debate I had, I sent somebody a paper. I said, look, this is a really good paper. It covers a number of key issues. It's a review article, covers a range of different topics here. And particularly the issue we're talking about is covered in here. That guy, and it was a guy, got back to me, within 3 minutes saying, no, this doesn't cover it. I said, what? That's a 60-page paper. You've read it in 3 minutes. What he did was do a keyword search on a particular term I'd used and said, I didn't find a keyword in there, therefore this paper is obviously irrelevant. That to me is just, and then the argument is, oh, well, you forget about those sociologists. They're not, they're not credible. They're not arguing from a rational basis. We are. That is just ridiculous. That is beyond, to claim that you're arguing rationally and then not to read, to actually sit down and read a particular paper rather than just, run through it, skim it for a particular key. If a PhD student were to do that, if an undergraduate, our undergraduates wouldn't do that. Our undergraduates are a pretty good bunch, and our postgraduate students are great. That's one of the great things about being an academic is you get to interact with students and teach them, and they teach you a great deal as well. And you just, if they were to do that, you'd go, what? Just imagine having an interview with a undergraduate student, and for a project, and you say, well, so what did you get from this paper? Well, I did a keyword search on this one keyword, and I couldn't find it, so therefore I rejected the paper. Right, your mark's fairly low. That's I think to come back to give you an answer to your question. How do we fix these things? How do we make a better level of or class of debate online? Anonymity. Let's try and chip away at this idea that you have to hide cravenly behind a pseudonym, particularly if you're throwing out a lot of abuse. I have no time, very little time. I qualified that, you notice. I have very little time for anonymity. And secondly, let's get people reading. On the anonymity thing, and then I'll shut up after this. And I did warn you, I tend to be.
I've been having a great time. This is I like hearing a good rant, especially ones that I'm cheering along.
The reason I qualified that is there are, of course, situations where you can justify anonymity. If somebody's a blogger and they're writing in fear of their lives, of course you can justify anonymity. If you're somebody, as I say, SJW Slayer 1992, and you're slinging out a load of nasty abuse to somebody who isn't anonymous, you're a dick. There's nothing, that's a lack of basic decency. It's the lack of social interaction. It's a lack of care and consideration for others. And, if that places me in the class of a social justice warrior, fine. I'm very happy to be a social justice warrior. In fact, those who are ranting like this and sending off all those SJWs, they're just arguing for a different form of social justice. They're as big a social justice warrior as the SJWs they're criticizing. It's just that their form of social justice, which is basically be as nasty as possible and don't constrain our right to say what the fuck we like, that's just their form of social justice. They are just as big a warrior. Anyway, rant over.
No, that was great. I've been holding off an applause. Yeah, if I can do the special effect, I would bring up the applause sound as well. Yeah, that was great, and I entirely agree. And I think that, well, one thing that I've been doing for a long time is when people say make ridiculous, unfounded claims, I just quote Hitchens back at them. You know, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. The starting point is your evidence.
Exactly.
Where is your evidence, and then we can have a talk.
And the other great thing, so I do a 4th-year module, which I really enjoy, actually, called the philosopher. The P's might be in the wrong way around. It's not quite alliteration, because it's not quite the same sign, but it's certainly the same letter. Philosophy, Perception, and Politics of Physics. And it's a 4th-year module. It's been running for the last 2 years. I really enjoy it. The students write some fantastically good work, and we cover a range of different things, including basic philosophy, which physics students and STEM students in general don't get half enough of.
Now they need, everyone needs more philosophy in the sciences.
Absolutely. Everyone
needs more philosophy in the sciences, all of them.
I agree entirely. And certainly as an undergraduate, I got no philosophy. Absolutely no philosophy. The vast majority of our students will get effectively no philosophy unless they do this 4th-year module, or unless they do the physics with philosophy course, the degree, the BSc, the bachelor's course, which only about 10 students per year do. But you know, there's this phrase that I always like to, and many scientists like to spin out, which is Feynman. Of course, we got to quote Feynman. I've hugely said many things. He was asked to define science in one sentence for, I think, a conference of school teachers. And the definition he came up with was, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Right? And when you hear that, first of all, particularly as an undergraduate, you get a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling, because you go, yeah, it's all about being really objective and looking at the evidence. Nobody does science like that. Nobody ignores expert opinion. Nobody ignores what's been in the literature and starts every experiment from scratch. Often, the key issue is that there's too much reliance on what's previously been published. I'm finally now getting back to that debate with that group at MIT and ETH I mentioned. So they published a paper, and then I was talking about artifacts, and we could explain what was going on just purely in terms of these very rudimentary artifacts. Those papers were published, as I said, 25 times, 25 different papers in very high quality journals, Nature Materials, Science, JACS, sorry, I'll spell out the acronym, Journal of the American Chemical Society, range of different journals. And then you might say, but why did they get published if it's wrong? Surely some other people could have spotted this. And in fact, there were rumors and things. Here's why they got published so many times. The first paper goes in with this artifact, with this misinterpretation of the data, goes out for a review. There's a monumental cock up when it comes to the review, and somehow the reviewers missed this artifact. Maybe it didn't go to scanning probe microscopists, maybe it went to other different researchers. Anyway, this paper gets published in Nature Materials, which is seen to be a pretty prestigious journal. You know what then happens next. The next paper that group publishes or submits based on those results, they cite their own Nature Materials paper, which is fair enough. Yeah. Goes to the reviewers. The reviewers go, oh, hang on, they've published in Nature Materials. There must be something in this. And you immediately set up a bias. And that builds and builds and builds. So this idea that, you know, everything is completely absent in science and peer review of any type of bias is ridiculous. Now, I've got to stop there and pause and make sure that I put very, how can I put it, a very big gulf between that type of bias and the idea, and I know it's popular and still quite popular in some social science circles, that everything is culturally determined. That's something that really a lot of physicists, like myself, have a great deal of issue with. You'll remember the whole Sakal thing, the social text thing, where he published a paper which was just full of nonsense and submitted to a leading social science journal. and was again on this idea that all of scientific results are actually culturally determined, and that there is no true objectivity there, that everything at some level is culturally determined. Now, so Carl made the following comment: if you really think that the Newton's laws and law of gravity is culturally determined, try stepping out the window of my apartment. I live on the 21st floor. So you've got to draw. There is, of course, to this, there are biases, etc. On the other hand, and this is key, when science gets it right, when we get beyond those biases, when we do things objectively, and sometimes it can take decades, sometimes centuries to get there, but it works. And it works phenomenally well, in that if I do a measurement and somebody on the other side of the world in Japan does the same measurement on a silicon surface and measures the separation of the atoms, we will agree, independently, we will agree to a very high precision. Similarly with quantum mechanics, which I mentioned before, wide range of other different aspects. For example, this most recent observation, this phenomenal observation of gravitational waves. There is, we need to be careful that we don't come down too hard on the side of objectivity or too hard on the side of cultural bias. It might sound somewhat boring, and it's not going to lead to too much clickbait, but I think we're somewhere in the middle. I think
it's a baby bear. It's a Goldilocks kind of situation. You're going to have people who are going to go extremes on both sides with many things: politics, their ontological views, all these things. And yeah, I think most people who approach it sensibly, not to say that they're not sensible for disagreeing, but the majority of people do tend to find that middle ground, because it's not, the extremes just don't seem as plausible, basically.
Yeah, it's you mentioned ontology as well. It's interesting. So I watched a little bit of, not that, maybe you did 3 of them, and I've certainly watched 1.5 of them, of your Social Science 101, which I find really, really interesting. And
thanks.
It was interesting. You're probably aware that there's a video which is critiquing one of those, and I really wish I could remember the guy's name, but he makes this point about ontology and epistemology. And interesting is in quantum mechanics at a very, very deep level, once you're down at the single particle level, that's an incredibly vexed issue in terms of what we describe quantum mechanical systems in terms of a wave function, and there's a debate that is raging, and many people fall one side or the other in terms of, is that wave function ontological or is it epistemological? Is it actually representing a reality out there, or is it purely our knowledge of the system? So it's interesting, just how at many different levels and in many different systems we have the same types of clashes, I guess, of almost ideology. So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, speaking of,
that's a lot. Sorry, I packed a lot into that.
Well, I was trying to decide if I should continue on the issue of ontology, or switch more over into the social sciences and get your take on as someone who's in the natural science field on the social sciences. And we're going to stipulate that some people have wacky ideas, and that's fine, but in the main.
No, that's fine. I think, and again, those wacky ideas, we do need to come back to those, I think, because I think they do your field a great disservice. And indeed, in some cases, they do feminism a great disservice as well. But in the main, so I collaborate with social scientists. In fact, we've got a grant running, started 1st of May, which involves a social scientist called Brigitte Nerlich here at Nottingham, who is going to be effectively embedded in the lab for a couple of hours every week, who's going to just sort of sit quietly or not so quietly in the corner, but I think we'd like her, and she'd like to be as much as possible a disinterested observer and see just how we interact, how we explain things, how we drive the experiments forward, how we drive the research program, which is 3.5 years forward. And this has been tried before, but it's not really been tried in terms of our area of physics, in terms of the single atom manipulation. And we are so much image driven and image interpretation driven. I'll be very keen to see how Brigitte's how can I take on this will either mesh with ours or be sort of polar opposite to ours in terms of just how we interpret the data we're getting. I have a lot of time for the social sciences. I would argue, I'm trying to choose my words here with care. I would argue that that's not a view that is incredibly well shared across the physical sciences. I would argue that there's a lot of skepticism about the value of social science across the physical sciences, and an awful lot of that time, that skepticism is either based again on just a few unrepresentative papers or a few unrepresentative results, and actually an unwillingness to connect, or it's based on just the idea that, well, it's only semi-quantitative. It can never be highly quantitative, like you have, in terms of the measurements we do in a piece of silicon, which is a hard lump of inorganic matter. You don't have all these sociological problems. You don't have all these controls to think about, etc., etc., etc. So I think the value of social science is probably not as widely appreciated. No, is definitely not as widely appreciated across the physical sciences as it should be, because us doing experiments at the single particle level, single atom level, thinking about how crystals grow, thinking about gravity, string theory, thinking all those things are important, but so too is how do we consider how society behaves? How do we consider different biases? How do we consider how politics works? We're not going to do that with the same type of ideology. Sorry, that's the wrong word. We're not going to do that with the same level of quantitative precision. I'm really trying to think of how to choose my words with care. We can't do that with the same level of quantitative precision. It has to be a much more statistical. It has to be a much more, in some ways, less focused. And I'd really like to hear your views on this, less focused approach than we have in physics. In physics, in many systems, what does a physicist, the running joke is, what's a cow to a physicist? Well, a cow is a large sphere. And if you want to add that little bit of extra detail, you'll add a little string on the end to represent the tail. But that's what we do. We simplify down. It's a very reductive approach. And in the social sciences, you just can't do that. You can't have this reductive approach. You can't screen out everything and just focus on this one parameter. And because of that, it's therefore felt that, well, they're not really doing science like a physicist. Not really doing science like a physicist would do it. Doesn't mean that it's not science. So it's I think there's a great deal of ignorance as well in some quarters, not in all quarters. I think things about something called the impact agenda in the UK, and I've been a major critic of it over the years. But I think one of the good things is that it started to connect the social sciences with the physical sciences a great deal more, and we need more of that. We really need more of that.
Yeah, I think interdisciplinary.
Did any of that make sense?
Yeah, well, did to me, and I'm sure that for the viewers did too. You were very clear and very coherent. But yeah, I think that interdisciplinary work is a good thing. The problem is then where do you get it published? Because there's not often the interdisciplinary journals that take something as niche as combining these things. But that's a different problem. So yeah, in terms of like how I approach what we do, I don't know to what extent people in the natural sciences understand the explosion in statistical analysis and statistical power and big data, and the ways that, just like with when, so science, let's say, started sort of like, 1600. And every time you guys got a new piece of tech, things got better. And it's very much the same with the social sciences, in my opinion. They kind of started, well, you get polling in the 30s and so forth, but it's really after the Second World War that I think most of the departments for political science and sociology really began to spring up. And we had very crude instruments. We had very crude survey instruments, and we've been refining them and improving them over time. But most importantly, when computers came around, we had the ability to do more statistical analysis than had ever been really possible when you were stuck with cross tabulations and small sample sizes of like around 150, and that would take you a really long time. So my PhD supervisor talked about for his I don't know if it was his master's thesis or his doctoral work, but having a shoebox full of punch cards because he wanted to test the relative deprivation theory on like 72 countries. And he had so entire boxes of these punch cards that he was, just to like have like 3 or 4 variables in a regression model. Well, now
it's heroic.
It is heroic, yeah, but he thought it was, time saving compared to doing it by hand.
Yeah.
But now we have the ability to, we're getting into the era of big data. Releasing your data set with your publication is now becoming standard in a lot of social science journals, so people can replicate your work. And we're doing things, time series analysis, most people will understand from unemployment trends over time, economic things, so you want to understand change over time in the economy. But also we're doing things like multi-level modeling, controlling for the individual level, the neighborhood level, and then the state level to try to isolate factors that are operating at different levels of social influence. We've got, structural equation modeling when we're looking at latent variables to try to see if the latent constructs of a set of questions in an international survey are the structural equation model that fits underneath is consistent across countries. So, we've done a lot of leaps and bounds. It's actually really hard for me in some ways to keep up with all of the new techniques that are constantly coming out and that you have to master. And then remember the ones that you knew already because you haven't used them in a long time or something. So what we do in the social sciences is, it's a fuzzier, let's say, here's a perfect example, perhaps. When I see the results of like the Clinton-Trump matchup in the US, and let's say the poll has her at 44% and him at 41%, and the margin of error of that poll is 3%, I add 3% plus and minus to both of those because I know it's not a fixed point, it's a band. And that's why we in the social sciences work with margins of error. We can tolerate a p is equal to or less than 0.05 because it doesn't matter like it would in medicine. If you've got a bit of error in the social sciences about the age effect, that's not going to kill anybody. But in medical sciences, you need things really, really precise with a high p-value, low p-value, p equals 0.001. So it's all about kind of like looking at those trends over time rather than making really precise estimates. And so I think that, when you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so I think maybe the disconnect there is we're being as rigorous. It's just that we have to be fuzzier and more tentative in our answers in order to make sure that we don't say things that are inaccurate. And maybe that makes us sound softer, but it makes us actually more honest.
More honest. Absolutely. No, this is exactly it. And in fact, the key thing, and coming back to Feynman again, is what's the sort of a key underlying characteristic of so much in science is uncertainty. Is that we can't, one thing that does drive me up the wall, and some people who say it's a matter of semantics, I would argue it's not a matter of semantics. I spent some time in the 4th-year course talking about this. You'll see time and time again, particularly in these YouTube threads, is that this paper proves, or this piece of science proves. Science doesn't prove anything. Now that might come across as a very semantic, but it's not. It's fundamental. Proof is a concept in pure mathematics. With science, we never prove anything in that mathematical sense. We get better and better guesses. We get better and better estimates, but we never know. Coming over the hill, there isn't something that's going to completely change our view. Again, I love coming back to quantum, but the bridge between Newtonian mechanics and quantum mechanics at one level, Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics, the physics of the world around us works extremely well, but we know that underlying that is something that until we get to those really small levels, it doesn't pop out. And so the idea that you can prove something with science is something we have to be very, very careful with. And it also, particularly in terms of public engagement and outreach and explaining science to the public, we have to be really careful to say that this is proven, because it's sending out the wrong message. And as you say, it's often fundamentally dishonest because we don't have that level of certainty. And we, as scientists, we live with that level of uncertainty. The key difference, I think one of the key differences, and harking back to a point I made before with the social sciences, is that we can set up fairly sophisticated controls. And we can hone in on just one or two variables, or even one variable, and change that variable, keeping everything roughly constant, or at least within bounds that we can control. The thing with the social sciences, and particularly, you know, the reason you and I started to exchange emails and started to chat was related to this whole Phil Mason sexual dimorphism thing, is how do you control for the, you know, those, how do you set up those controls in a sociological, in a system whereby there are so many variables that can contribute, and how do you just sift out and say it's just this effect? We can ignore all the environmental variables because we've just isolated this effect. That to me seems like a remarkable claim. It would be a remarkable claim in many areas of physics, but particularly in the social sciences, to say that we can screen out all these variables and just focus on just one variable, particularly in these complex sociological systems with lots of interplay. In the technical term, and I'm using the term chaos in its true technical sense, it's a non-linear, incredibly chaotic system, very sensitive to small changes in initial conditions or any conditions along the way. That to me, you know, seems to be you know, a real difficulty with the social sciences in terms of just how do you control parameters. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, actually, I was going to jump in because I haven't really had a chance to talk about it in
Please
any
do.
video in particular, but as part of my doctoral thesis, because I was interested for the social sciences, especially British political science, actually American political science as well, but disambiguating the more social norms of gender from the biological drivers. And in my second year, which is usually where you get lost when you're doing a PhD, I went down this sort of, you know, left turn where I wanted to investigate, and it was good to do, but all of the possible biological drivers. And the closest thing that was being done in political science was some work on tying a particular, possessing, this was like back in the early 2000s, so I'm kind of reaching back into my memory here, but it had to do with a fashion to try to link genetics to political preferences or people's political worldviews. The problem with it was, in terms of generalizing to a wider population, was that in order to control for everything, they had to use twin studies. So where they wanted to look at the genetic, like possessing this gene, and then how people ended up in terms of their political ideology, twin studies allowed them to look at fraternal twins, identical twins, twins that had been brought up together, twins that had been separated from birth. But even those twins were like from a study that was based in Minnesota that was, you know, collected with some Americans and probably disproportionately white, and, you know, a lot of these other things. So yeah, your point is exactly straight, you know, dead on, that to make that move from a biological on-off switch or a causal mechanism, whatever you want to try to test, to a particular social outcome, you know, the closest we could get through experiment is twin studies, but then those have limitations for generalization. And then another possibility would be to go to everybody who's run for office and try to get them to give in a sample of, you know, for how much testosterone they have. And then, you know, like look at that compared to how many people there are, you know, the range in the population. But then you'd also have to control for like what birth order they were. Were they a first child? Because we know first children are more likely to preserve. Exactly. So by the time you build in all these other possible variables that you would need to control for, the chance of that one little hormone having any explanation left by the time the model is run is just non-existent.
Precisely, and if I can couch it in the terms of a mathematician or a physicist, the problem is not that there are so many of these variables, is that they're not, as we put it, linearly independent. They are all cross-coupled. You change this one and you change this over here. The twin studies thing is interesting. There's a guy called Oliver James you might have heard of. Now, he falls, to put it mildly, extremely heavily on the nurture versus the nature side. I would argue that he overreaches occasionally, but his books are pretty good. I got a book that he'd written called "They Fuck Us Up," if you'll excuse the language. Yeah. It's a line from a Larkin poem about what your parents do. Yeah. So it's But he makes the point, when you talk about an environment, you have to be really careful to tease out what exactly you mean with environment. Because he argues, right, you could say that two kids brought up in the same house with the same parents in a reasonably stable environment, going to the same school, or all have exactly the same environment. But of course they don't, particularly for the first few years. Let's say one of those kids is 3 years older than the other. For those first 3 years, that first kid has a completely different environment. Moreover, the very fact that the kid was firstborn or secondborn will change to some degree how the parents interact with that child. So, in that sense, you've got an incredibly complex environmental mix of parameters. And then to break this down and say, well, no, actually, it's purely due to these biological differences, and we can tease those out. I have yet to see I'd really like to hear from you on this. I've yet to see a credible study which normalized out for environmental effects. Time and again, you'll always have a disclaimer in these papers which are attempting to look for gender differences. There will be a disclaimer. Well, of course, we've got to bear in mind that there will be, socio-economic or other types of societal contributions to this. Have you seen studies which have credibly normalized out environmental effects, particularly when it comes to gender differences?
No. No.
Exactly. And I guess I should point out, I think we were chatting before we went live, Kristi, and I said that I was admissions tutor. So I'm admissions tutor for physics.
Bring that up.
Which means that what that means in the UK parlance is that I oversee, along with a couple of colleagues, applications to the department. What's very interesting is that the gender balance in physics, both at A level, so at high school, is about 80 male to 20% female, and that continues into undergraduate physics. What's very interesting is that the balance in maths at A level is much more 50-50, and indeed at university is much more 50-50. So that alone is very interesting. And, the reason I wrote that blog post to which you referred right at the start is that I had this discussion on something called the Magic Sandwich Show, which I've agreed I'll be on. I got another invitation, very kind invitation from DPR Jones, and I'll be on that next week, discussing actually probably peer review as well. But it's because Phil Mason, I don't have a huge amount of time for sort of juvenile handles like Thunderfoot, so let's call him by his real name, Dr. Phil Mason. So Dr. Mason was making this claim that you could also tie gender differences in physics back to sexual dimorphism, which, as I said in the blog post, is just, how can you make that claim? How can you deconvolve, and I'll use the technical mathematical physical term, how can you deconvolve out the environmental influences in any way that's credible? And in fact, I think it's pretty well an impossible problem, because how can you ever credibly deconvolve out those influences? I cannot, having read through a number of the papers, read through a reasonable amount of the literature, but certainly not as much as you have, and certainly not as much as your colleagues in social science have. To me, it just seems like an almost impossible, if not an impossible task to out those influences when it comes to looking at whether it's nature versus nurture, when it comes to aptitude and interest, or even preference in terms of STEM subjects versus other subjects.
And I think a big problem that they have is, it's fine to advance a theory, but first, your theory is going to have to account for all the evidence. So how does a biological determinism or a sexual dimorphism theoretical framework account for change over time? Because we've seen rapid changes in a few decades. So how does your theory account for that?
Absolutely. Exactly. And then the thing you get back, and I noticed some of the comments under your video, and this guy you've had the debates with in the past, I forget his name. Sorry, it's late, and I'm...
you mean the guy on the bit that I debated online? Like Sargon, or is it someone in the comments?
No, another guy. It was about the rape culture.
Noel Plum.
The guy's name.
Yeah,
Thank you, Noel Plum. And he makes the argument, to be fair, actually, some of his comments are quite a little bit more... I guess reasonable in terms of how he spends a reasonable amount of time clearly thinking them through, it appears. But he makes the point that, or he asks, let me try and choose my words with care here. He sets it up again as this very polarized thing. It's saying, well, you're saying it's purely nurture. We're not. Well, certainly I'm not. I'm saying we do not know, and I cannot see how we could ever know that how much of it is due to any type of genetic component, a biological component, and how much of it is actually due to the societal component. If Noel or anybody else watching this knows how we credibly decouple those two things and work out, okay, this is 70% and this is 30% or vice versa, please tell me, because I genuinely do not know. And as a physicist, as a physical scientist looking at this problem, to me, it just seems like a mass of interrelated variables that couple together. How you would ever model that credibly, you know, we've systems like the bloody simple pendulum. You take a pendulum that moves back and forth under a driving force. That will behave, you'd think that would always behave nice and regularly. If you drive that hard enough, it'll behave chaotically. And chaotically, not in the sense of random, but chaotically in the sense of a non-linear system being driven, etc. And that, you know, that's a bloody pendulum. That's a pendulum, and it's an exceptionally, incredibly complicated system with, let me say, many variables. We'd have the driving force, we'd have the amplitude of the driving force, the frequency of the driving force, we'd have the natural resonance of the pendulum, maybe 4 variables, maybe 4. And we struggle, and it's only, you know, over the last 40 years with the developments of nonlinear dynamics and chaos, we finally got to understand that. To then extrapolate out to a system which has got hundreds of variables all coupled into each other, and then to credibly claim that we can pull out, this is the genetic component and this is the environmental component.
Yeah, a friend of mine once said the world is one big endogenous mess, and like, yeah, you got a point. But the other thing too is, yes, the sort of picking up the polar opposite. So because I say that there's no evidence for biological causal mechanisms for social outcomes, then the assumption becomes, you know, you're saying it's all nurture. Like, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there's no evidence to support that position. And no matter how many times people try to make the argument, well, it just makes sense. Of course it would be the case. Look, male monkeys like to play with boy toys. Of course there's biological. Like, no, you have to come with evidence first. Where's your evidence?
It is remarkable, yeah. It's just obvious that males and females are different, therefore their aptitudes are going to be that. You know, how unbelievably close to the argument is. Look at the complexity of an eye. This must have a designer. How could this ever have evolved?
You said it better. Yeah, that's my point. You said it perfectly. You said it perfectly.
Personal incredulity, and these are the people that argue with creationists saying that that's it, and yet at the same time they're going, oh, it's got to be, look, males and females are different, therefore they're going to have differences when it comes to evidence. Show us evidence. And the thing is, the issue here is, as I say, is that I don't see how you can credibly normalize out the environmental component. I honestly don't see how you can ever do that with any type of credibility.
The other thing that they will have to do, and I think this gets left out, is you have to not only account for variation between the sexes, if we just sort of homogenize it into binary, but you also have to be able to account for variation within the sexes and whether or not there's crossover. So if you have women who, let's say, do have a high level of testosterone, you know, then other women and men who are lower, and then women that are higher are performing differently than the men who are at the lowest end of the spectrum, is it really then a sex difference? Because it seems to me like it's the hormone, not their biological sex. So this, you know, conflation of sex with like sex, you know, chemicals, or I don't know what else is supposed to be driving these differences. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of explanation that those theories have to do that I don't think that they've really thought through all the way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so it's coming back to the admissions tutor thing. It is interesting. It is, what I find fascinating is that you've got this roughly almost parity when it comes to maths, but not for physics, and certainly not for engineering. And it is interesting just how we approach that, and why, I don't know why at secondary school, at high school level, the bias, despite the fact that at sort of earlier on in the high school cycle, again, it's roughly parity when it comes to science. When it comes to choosing physics, it tends to be so heavily weighted towards males. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that the Institute of Physics in the UK has been looking at for quite some time, and it's been stuck at that 80-20 level for about 25 years. And now the argument you'll get from some quarters is, well, of course, that's it, because girls don't like physics. It's innately unwired into them. Yeah, again, evidence, show us evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's many stories, and I guess, some of this, what I'm about to say, is anecdotal, of course, but there are papers out there which have looked at this in detail, and reports from the Institute of Physics in particular have looked at this in detail with regard to being told. I've colleagues whose daughters have been told, you do maths very well for a girl, you do physics well for a girl,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And it's those little things that how do you quantify the role of those? And of course, again, I can just see the comment section filling up. Well, they shouldn't be so sensitive. They shouldn't be sensitive. Generally, from people hiding behind a pseudonym. If you're going to complain about people not being too sensitive, how about stepping out from behind that pseudonym? Otherwise, you're gutless and you're witless and you're lacking in any type of decency. And surely you wouldn't get offended by that, because those are only words, etc., etc. But this is you can probably sense my frustration at seeing these same silly arguments coming up time and time again.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing too is not just the person who's receiving the comments. So obviously, repeated comments like that will have an impact, but it also is a window into the perspective of the person who has authority. And I think there was a study, and I was talking about like the review of some female applicants, and some of the comments were like, well, I'd want to make sure she had single authored papers, or I'd want to make sure that she, got the grant on her own, and the questions that were not asked of similar male applicants. So I do think that, the role of bias, and this isn't, of course, and I did a video on the settled biases, kind of to set up this talk, actually, the study that was done for the PNAS. Yes. The idea is that women were having the same views as their male colleagues. So this isn't like men are bad and women are victims. There are stereotypes in the culture that we're all susceptible to, that we all have to stop and check. And that stopping and checking isn't offensive, and it's not, giving people special rights. It's about questioning the assumptions we're making, like you were saying before, not just accepting everything on face value, not accepting just because it came from science that now it's more credible than something that comes from a slightly lower tier journal. You still have to check your own biases, wherever those might be. And when we look around, we know that there are biases in the society, and it obviously makes sense that those would carry on with normal people. So again, this isn't about men are bad and women are good. It's about we all have these things. Yeah. And what can we do?
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, there are talented women who have lived and died, and who could have maybe solved problems in maths, or created great pieces of art, who were never given the chance because educating them wasn't even an option. And our talent is what propels us forward as a species. And if we're going to save ourselves on this planet, because we're fucking it up pretty bad right now, then we're going to need all of the talent, all the brain power we can have working on those problems.
Precisely.
And to just dismiss a disproportionate amount of women, those talents not coming forward, that's a problem.
Absolutely, huge problem. It's interesting. I got a book from a colleague who's just written a really good book on maths for physical sciences. So that type of book is lacking actually for undergraduates. And he lists at the front a whole list of important contributions, important scientists who've made contributions to each of the chapters. And he goes all the way back. He does a really good job. He goes back to number theory and the Greeks, etc., and goes all the way through. And I looked through it. I'll maybe have to look through it again, but certainly I couldn't see any women there. And now the argument,
you finished
in terms of 3 pages. 3 pages of scientists, and the argument will be made, oh, that's just because women just don't have those talents, and again completely ignoring the sort of entire cultural, societal, environmental aspects of just why that entire list doesn't have rather more females mathematicians or scientists listed there.
Yeah, I was looking up to it was just make your point, which is I was just checking on my phone to make sure Marie Curie was French, but I was at the Eiffel Tower and I noticed that there are names, and there are names of famous French thinkers engraven in big letters around the Eiffel Tower that you can read them, and there's not a single woman even though Marie Curie was one of the greatest, like contributors in her time, and she's French, and they could put her on there, but she's not. And maybe that's changed, but I'm pretty sure there's not a single woman on the Eiffel Tower, and she seems like an obvious omission.
Yeah, and as you say, it's subtle and non so subtle biases. If you go into many physics departments, including some of the older ones, and you look up at the walls, it's pictures of old white blokes, right? And everywhere, despite the fact that there may well be, even from that particular department, there may well be women who've made very strong contributions. But the message you get, and in terms of reinforcing your biases, is what does a physicist look like? And unfortunately, look at me. I'm pretty well on that stereotype: white, bearded, graying, etc. And you ask kids, I go into schools reasonably regularly. It's great going into primary. So great going into primary schools and talking about science. The kids are so great. But you ask them to draw a picture of a scientist. You know what it's going to look like. You know what it's going to look. I don't have to explain.
Man in a lab coat.
So if that bias. Absolutely, with the hair also, the mad hair, and if that bias is established at such an early age, if that's what a scientist looks like, it really is something we've got to bear in mind, and something we've got to try to counter. And I think, to be fair to us, I don't want to be the voice of doom. I like being the voice of doom and gloom, but what's it? Yeats, I think it was Yeats, has a sense of abiding tragedy that sustains him through temporary periods of joy. That was his description of the Irish. Yeah, I'm fairly pissed off most of the time. But I do think we are incrementally, in some ways, certainly in the science, at least there's a recognition now that this is something we've got to think about and something we've got to try and counter, which there wasn't even. I started as a lecturer in '97, so. Oh, geez,
not that long ago.
20 years ago.
Yeah,
Sorry?
Not that long ago.
Yeah. But even then, 20 years ago, there was there was little recognition of this, very little recognition of this. And it's been going on. There are things like the Athena Swan Award. There are various different types of strategy, a lot of which, to be fair, is driven by the Institute of Physics in the UK, but also the Royal Society and the research councils as well. And of course, I'm speaking from a physicist perspective. But there is a recognition there, so it's not all doom and gloom. I do think, though, if you look at those bloody YouTube comment threads, we've got a long way to go. Just on that final point, and I will shut up after this.
No, really. I'll stop saying that, because I'll always intervene if I need to.
Okay, good. You just interrupt me wherever you like. It's interesting because the postdocs and the students in the group think I am absolutely mad beyond the point of no return for actually interacting in YouTube comments threads. Their argument, the vast majority of those threads represent the condensed collective stupidity of humanity. Why would you ever go into that cesspit? And the reason I go in, there's one thing is just to put a country voice there, of course, but also for some channels, it's not like that. So I work with this guy, Brady Harron, he does a range of different channels. He used to be a BBC video journalist. And he's got a range of these different. Numberphile is the most popular, which is something like 1.5 million subscribers at this point, hundreds of millions of views. We do something called 60 Symbols, which is a physics-based channel. And generally, not always, but generally, the comments and the discussion there is not only intelligent, but often quite erudite under the videos. And in fact, a couple of research ideas and a couple of research projects, including one recent one on drumming, have actually stemmed to a certain extent for those type of discussions. So I'm not willing yet to give up that on sort of online communication, but I do, and I'm going to get back on my soapbox, I do think that anonymity is one of the key issues. And if we need to tackle and make hiding behind a synonym, hiding behind a pseudonym, much less, how can I put it, just accepted than it currently is. And I certainly, if somebody's throwing out abuse, just challenge them on it and say, who are you to throw out abuse when you're hiding behind a pseudonym? It's just pitiful, awful behavior.
And to build on your optimism.
That's enough for me.
Yeah, so to build on your optimism, I was reminded that of a great documentary was Misrepresentation. They have a new film out now about, so misrepresentation was women's representation in the media and politics. They have another one out now called The Mask You Wear, or The Mask You Live In, which is about the ways that boys are brought up to repress their emotions. They're taught to be a man, which means being cold and being in control, and being angry is okay. Kicking someone's ass is okay, but crying is not okay. So anyway, one of the phrases they had in Misrepresentation is a commonly used phrase, like in feminist circles: you can't be what you can't see. And one of the things that gives me hope is when I look around at this sort of if you look around at television and some of the characters that are coming up, you're seeing women as the computer geeks. You're seeing women in the labs in the CSI shows. You're seeing women head up teams and be making decisions in a leadership role. And those are all things that I didn't have really growing up. And I'm hoping that, in another 20 years, girls who grow up thinking that, what's her name, Felicity Smoke on the Arrow was just really cool, the way she could just hack into things, that will filter into their peer consciousness, and also the teachers' levels of consciousness, and we'll see even more equality or like balance across the sciences and other fields too. I think things could be opened up. There's a lot of nursing needed. There's a lot of nurses out there, and guys who want good paying jobs. We need a lot of trained nurses, so go into nursing. I don't want to just put all this on women's promotion. There's balance that's needed all over.
Primary school teachers as well. Primary school teachers, if I look at my kids' school, I was governor for my kids' school for a little while, the vast majority of the teachers there are female. It would be good to have good role models, male role models in there as well. And again, it's because, you're not, the biases and the pressures are away from that type of career, which is a real shame. Real shame.
Yeah. So now that we've righted all the wrongs of the world, I think this has been an amazing chat. And I know you felt like you talked a lot, but really, I really enjoy talking with you or hearing what you have to say, because, well, I wasn't, you come from a different field, but we have so many of shared opinions. And my PhD supervisor used to like to go on a pretty good rant, and I haven't seen him in a few years, so I felt a little bit like I was back in my PhD, sort of like just sitting back and letting my supervisor. He swore a lot more, so you were pretty clean. But
oh wow! I wish you'd told me that at the start. So my PhD supervisor and I, so he was Irish as well. We used to be able to communicate entirely in just expletives. He's just a master. He can get nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, subordinate clauses connected with expletives. He's just unbelievable. And we used to be able to communicate like that. Just everything would be.
What just jumped to mind? I don't know if you've seen The Wire.
Fuck.
Yeah. Have you seen The Wire, the first season, where the two cops are going through the room?
I haven't.
Okay, well, there's a scene where the two cops go through the room, they figure out a murder, but the only dialogue that's spoken is motherfucker, 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 motherfucker. And it's like, so that's what up to mind.
About it, though. Yeah, there's something great about those expletives, so it's just the oomph they have. Of course, in Ireland, we have feck, which is the less bad F word, which we can drop in if we really want to say
that
fuck,
is really nice.
Drop into feck.
Yeah.
So it's really helpful. So good. Yeah, it's been a huge pleasure, Kristi. I'll actually be in contact with regard to this fourth year module I mentioned. It would be good to either have you there as a sort of video presence, or indeed in person to do a session, to do a seminar for that. I think it'd be really good. So we have a number of invited seminars. So last year we had two philosophers. The year before we had somebody on responsible innovation, etc. So it'd be great to have, and we've had social scientists before as well. So it'd be great to have you over. I'll send you an email and we can hopefully organize that. It's in the first semester next academic year, so it'll be sometime between October and December. But
that's perfect.
We can exchange emails.
That sounds great. And hopefully we can exchange emails too, and having you on again, because this has been so nice. I would love to do it again in future.
Thank you, Kristi. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's always very cathartic to rant.
Well, like I said, it was a fantastic time. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. So, all right. So what I'll do is, I'll give you a chance to say goodbye. We've had, I think, at peak 10 viewers. Now we're currently at 7. So if you want to say goodbye to everyone who's currently watching, and I'll do the outro, and then I'll go off air and we can talk afterwards.
Brilliant. Yeah. So thank you for those who are watching. I know this will go on YouTube as well, so I look forward with all my comments about YouTube comment threads in mind. I look forward to seeing the YouTube comments threads, and I might indeed, time permitting, though I've got a huge amount of exam marking coming up, I'll try and drop in there and make my points as frequently as possible. It's been a huge pleasure to finally meet Kristi. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope we can do it again. Thanks, Kristi.
Likewise. Yeah, great. So if you want to learn more, you want to say the name of your blog? I'll put a link to it below, and anything else you want to put out at this point.
That's wonderful. So yeah, the name of the blog is Symptoms of the Universe. I'm a huge heavy metal fan. Those of you who are similarly heavy metal fans will know the origin of that. For those of you who aren't, there's a very famous Black Sabbath song called Symptom of the Universe, but I just added an S in there. So it covers a wide range of different things. There's some technical physics stuff on there. There's a lot about higher education and rants about just the increasing marketization, the increasing commercialization of higher education and education in general. There's also some links back to some of the stuff we do with 60 symbols, which some of you might find interesting if you've got even a modicum of interest in physics. With 60 symbols, what we try to do is pitch it to as wide an audience as possible. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we do a semi-good job, but it goes all the way from sort of 5 to 85 in terms of the viewership. Anyway, that's more than enough plugs. Thanks,
yeah, okay.
Kristi.
And the Magic Sandwich Show. All right. So coming up, and we'll talk about that. Yes. All right. So thanks everyone for watching. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome, and I'll be back tomorrow when I have my Patreon hangout. If you want the details on that, check the video that's called something like updates and outtakes or something, because I've got all the details there. All right. Thanks for watching, you guys, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.